Welcome to today's historical deep dive. He commanded armies, reshaped continents, and declared himself emperor, rising from obscurity to challenge the established order of Europe. But what happens when the relentless engine of ambition finally meets an insurmountable obstacle? We're Sleepy History, and we journey through the lives of giants, dissecting their triumphs and understanding their falls. If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin. And change the way you think about history. You stand on the edge of everything you've built. The year is 1812. Before you stretches an endless, indifferent plain, swallowed by the immensity of Russia. Behind you lies Paris, Europe, the culmination of 15 years of relentless ambition, audacious victory, and absolute control. You are Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, and the world bends to your will, or so you believe. From the sun-drenched plains of Italy to the freezing snows of Austerlitz, you have rewritten the rules of warfare and carved an empire from chaos. Kings bow, empires fall, and the very map of Europe shifts at your command. Your name is synonymous with destiny. Ask yourself, was this brilliance or hubris? For here, on the banks of the Niemen River, a new kind of challenge awaits. Not an army you can outmaneuver, or a capital you can occupy to force terms, but the sheer, brutal scale of a continent, a people who will burn their own land rather than yield, and an enemy far more formidable than any general, winter itself. This is not just another campaign. It is the ultimate test of your power, your judgment, and your fate. Every instinct, honed in 1,000 battles, screams for caution, for compromise. Yet, your pride, your insatiable need for absolute dominance, whispers louder. Russia defies your continental system. Russia harbors your enemies. Russia is the last major piece on the board that does not move precisely as you dictate. The Tsar, once your ally, now stands defiant. What would you have done, standing in his boots, when the crown feels heavy with absolute power? So, you gather the largest army ever assembled on European soil. Over 600,000 men from 20 nations, a polyglot mass of hopes, fears, and unquestioning loyalty to the eagle. It is a logistical marvel, a terrifying display of power. It is also a fragile behemoth, dependent on perfect execution in an imperfect world, led by a man who now believes himself infallible. This decision, born of unparalleled success and unyielding will, is the hinge upon which the rest of your life and the fate of your empire will turn. It is the moment ambition ceases to be a tool and becomes a blinding force, leading you into the greatest trap of your career. The air is heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes either glory or ruin. There is no turning back now. You raise your hand, the signal is given, and the vast, shimmering human tide begins to cross into the heart of darkness. Geek Empire, whispers of hubris. You stand at the zenith. Europe bends the knee. From Madrid's sun-baked squares to the cold plains bordering Russia, your eagles fly. An empire, built on speed and blood and audacious strokes, stretches across a continent. Kings are now mere appointments, dukes your loyal subjects. The Pope, the supposed head of Christendom, lives under your protection, a gilded prisoner whose spiritual authority buckles under the weight of your temporal power. You dictate trade routes, Redraw centuries-old borders with the stroke of a pen forged in conquest. Your will is enforced by an army that has known little but victory for a decade. No coalition dares gather against you now, their treasuries depleted, their confidence shattered. You are, for this fleeting moment, the undisputed master of the Western world. This is the intoxicating, blinding height of power. Years of relentless ambition, strategic brilliance, and sheer force of personality have brought you here. The air is thin at the summit, but the view, the sheer scope of your dominion, is intoxicating. Success, unprecedented and absolute, begins to curate its own reality. Past victories aren't just history. They become prophecy. Every challenge overcome, every enemy crushed, serves as further proof that you are not merely lucky or skilled, but favored by destiny itself. This creates an echo chamber of infallibility. The voices of caution, the practical limitations, the simple inconvenient truths that might temper your plans, they are drowned out by the cheers of the loyal, the flattery of the ambitious, and the overwhelming internal conviction that you cannot fail. Dissent doesn't sound like wisdom, it sounds like betrayal or weakness. How could those who achieved less know more than you, who have achieved everything? The irony is profound. The very engine that propelled you upwards, boundless ambition, supreme confidence, an unwavering belief in your own judgment, is now the greatest threat to your position. Greatness, unchecked by humility or self-awareness, becomes brittle. You believe you command destiny, like a grandmaster dictating the board, forgetting that destiny, like a sudden storm, first words, ultimately commands everyone. This pinnacle is not a secure fortress. It is a high-wire act, and the slightest misstep, fueled by the conviction that you can't fall, will send you plummeting. What would you have done standing in those boots, with the world at your feet and the whisper of infallibility in your ear? Would you have heard the soft warnings, or would you have already believed yourself beyond needing them? This is the moment the foundation for future collapse is laid, not by an external enemy, but by the corrosive effect of absolute power on the soul. The empire gleams, a vast, imposing structure built on conquest and audacious reform. From Madrid to Warsaw, your will is law, your vision shaping a continent. But look closer. Beneath the polished facade, the stone is starting to crumble, hairline cracks appearing in the grand design you believe is flawless. The continental system, conceived as the economic siege that would starve Britain into submission, is instead strangling your own allies and subjects. Ports lie idle, merchants face ruin, and smugglers thrive. Resentment festers, a slow poison working its way through the veins of the empire. Nations you compelled into this alliance chafe under its restrictions, their loyalty eroding with every unsold cargo ship. This wasn't just a miscalculation. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of economic interdependence and the limits of coercion. It's the brilliant chess move that sacrifices your own pawns, assuming the enemy king is worth the cost, but forgetting your pawns might simply abandon the board. Then there is Spain. What began as a swift, dynastic maneuver becomes a brutal, drawn-out nightmare, the Peninsular War. It's not a war of armies clashing on open fields, but 1,000 small cuts from unseen enemies. Guerrilla warfare, a concept the formal strategies of the Grand Army struggle to comprehend, bleeds your treasury dry and ties down hundreds of thousands of your finest troops in a savage, unwinnable quagmire. A festering wound you constantly underestimate, dismissing it as a mere distraction, a band of brigands resisting progress. You call it the Spanish ulcer, a chillingly accurate description of a persistent, draining affliction you refuse to treat properly. Around you, voices murmur caution. Talleyrand, your cynical but often insightful diplomat, hints at the strain. Your marshals, tired from constant campaigns, express wariness. Reports detail the growing unrest, the economic hardship, the sheer cost in blood and treasure. But their words are inconvenient. They challenge the narrative of unstoppable progress, the myth of your infallible judgment. You explain away the failures. The Spanish resistance is fanaticism. The economic woes are temporary sacrifices necessary for victory. You become increasingly isolated by your own certainty. This period isn't just about strategic errors. It's about the leader's most dangerous blind spot, the inability to see or accept criticism, especially when that criticism validates your deepest anxieties about the sustainability of your ambition. When every setback is explained away or blamed on others, you lose the capacity for course correction. Convinced the path is right, only the followers are faltering. Ask yourself, when the murmurs of doubt surround you, do you listen, or do you simply raise your voice louder to drown them out? What would you have done, standing in his boots, with the weight of a continent on your shoulders, and the fear of showing weakness gnawing at your core? The seeds of your greatest defeat were sown not on the frozen plains of Russia, but in the fertile ground of unheeded warnings and the quiet rot of ignored realities. Closer to home than you ever cared to admit. You stand on a rise, perhaps near the Vistula, and the world unfurls before you not as geography, but as sheer, unstoppable force. Below, stretching to the horizon, is the Grand Army. It is not merely an army, it is a continent on the march. French guardsmen, their bearskins gleaming, rub shoulders with Bavarians, Prussians, Poles, Italians, Swiss, Dutch, Spanish, a staggering assembly drawn from every corner of your vast empire and your reluctant allies. The numbers are mind-boggling, unprecedented. Over 500,000 soldiers, perhaps 600,000 when you factor in support personnel. And behind them, an even larger multitude of horses, draft animals, and the vast train of wagons. Picture it, columns of infantry stretching for miles, a river of steel and wool. Cavalry squadrons, a shimmering lake of horseflesh, fill the plains. The air is thick with the dust kicked up by countless boots and hooves, the distant clang of metal, the murmur of 100 different languages. This is the behemoth you have forged, a testament to your organizational genius, your iron will, and the resources you have bled from Europe. Wagons groan under the weight of biscuit, grain, fodder, cannonballs, medical supplies, a logistical burden that would crush a lesser administrator. Engineers span rivers with pontoon bridges, as if conjuring land from water. The sheer scale is intoxicating, a visible manifestation of your power, your reach. It feels invincible. But even as you watch this magnificent machine assemble, a knot of unease should be tightening in your gut. This scale is also a warning. Feeding this many mouths, both human and animal, requires staggering daily tonnage, a mountain of supplies that must be dragged across vast, potentially barren distances. Moving this diverse host, coordinating their movements, ensuring they stay together, watered and supplied, is a logistical undertaking bordering on the miraculous. It's not just a campaign, it's a migration of nations. Here lies the critical tension, the hidden fault line beneath this seemingly invincible force. Your ambition has created the largest army ever seen, designed to overwhelm any resistance through sheer mass. But this mass itself creates a monumental logistical problem that has never been solved on this scale. Strategy, you have always known, is about more than brilliant maneuvers. It's about potatoes and boots, fodder and musket balls arriving where and when they are needed. This massing of forces reveals a profound truth. Strategy must always be grounded in feasible execution. A plan that relies on perfect weather, intact roads, cooperative locals, and logistics overcoming impossible distances through sheer willpower is not a strategy. It is, frankly, a prayer. You are betting everything, staking the future of your empire on the assumption that your ability to command men, to inspire them, to drive them forward, can somehow overcome the immutable laws of physics, the brutal reality of distance, and the harshness of nature. The takeaway here is a timeless lesson in leadership, etched in the dust of a million marching feet. Grand visions are essential. They provide the destination, the purpose, but they must be paired with meticulous planning and a deep, honest understanding of limitations. Over-leveraging your resources, believing that sheer scale or overwhelming power guarantees success, is perhaps the most common pitfall of ambitious leaders. Your army is mighty, a marvel of organization and power, but its very size makes it fragile, vulnerable to disruption, delay, and the simple, devastating fact of hunger and exhaustion spread across hundreds of miles. It is a fact you seem, in this moment of ultimate power, unwilling or unable to fully confront. Ask yourself now, gazing upon this endless sea of soldiers, was this genius, or the first, most visible sign of irreversible hubris? Under the surreal glow of the midnight sun, the air hums with the colossal effort. Before you, the vast, dark expanse of the Niemen River flows. Pontoon bridges, hastily constructed yet sturdy, span the water. Dark arteries pumping the lifeblood of your grand army into the heart of Russia. This is not just a crossing. It is a spectacle of terrifying scale, a physical manifestation of ambition made flesh. Thousands upon thousands of men, a diverse tapestry of nations bound by your will. Horses straining under their loads, cannons rumbling like distant thunder, an endless, unstoppable torrent streams eastward. Each passing soldier, each loaded cart, is a step deeper into the unknown, a further commitment etched onto the landscape itself. He watches, maybe from a low rise, the sheer, impossible volume of his undertaking. This moment is a deliberate, conscious echo, a terrifying mirror held up to history. Caesar crossed the Rubicon with a single legion, sealing the fate of a republic. You crossed the Niemen with 500,000, gambling with an empire. But where Caesar's act was decisive, yours feels like the beginning of an unraveling, a tightening knot of fate. Then comes the act that chills the blood. As the last units complete the passage, the command is given. The pontoon bridges, the very lifelines back to safety, are dismantled, packed away, severed. This is no accident. It is a strategic choice, brutal in its clarity. There is no easy retreat, no quick escape route should things turn against you. You have burned the bridges, quite literally, trapping yourself and your entire force on hostile ground. The psychological weight of this irreversibility is immense. Once the die is cast on such a monumental scale, the pressure to justify the decision, to push forward regardless of mounting difficulties, becomes an almost unbearable force. Retreat isn't just a military maneuver. It becomes synonymous with failure, a word you have systematically erased from your vocabulary, from your very being. It's a surprising insight. True courage in leadership isn't solely the boldness to initiate something massive and risky, but also the profound humility and wisdom to recognize when to stop, when to pivot, when the initial gamble is turning sour. By cutting off that easy path back, by physically dismantling the option of retreat, you haven't just committed to victory. You've doubled down on the initial gamble, trapping yourself and your grand army in a commitment that will ultimately, inexorably consume you. You crossed a river seeking glory, but you entered a sea of troubles, a vast, cold ocean where retreat is death and only forward remains, into the storm. Ask yourself, was this the ultimate display of unwavering resolve, or the definitive act of a leader trapping himself within his own hubris? What does it mean when cutting off options is seen as strength, but becomes the very chain that binds you to destruction? The Grande Armée, a colossal serpent of men in steel, slithers deeper into the vast green belly of Russia. You ride at its head, still possessed by the fire of Smolensk, the expectation of the grand confrontation that must come. Your strategic mind, honed on the battlefields of Europe, craves the decisive clash, the meeting of main forces where genius can shatter armies and dictate peace. This is your preferred language of war, swift, brutal, definitive. But Russia speaks a different tongue. As you advance, village after village lies deserted. The houses stand empty, the fields stripped bare. Barns and stores are not merely abandoned, but meticulously emptied or set alight, sending plumes of smoke curling against the endless sky. The ground itself seems to conspire against you. Wells are fouled, bridges destroyed, roads little more than tracks swallowed by mud or dust. The land is becoming, by deliberate design, a wasteland before your very eyes. You push forward, your powerful columns eating up the leagues, but finding only absence. This is not retreat born of fear, but a calculated withdrawal, a strategy woven into the very fabric of this immense nation. The Russians understand their limitations on the open field against your veterans, against you, so they refuse the field entirely. They trade space for time, for the grinding attrition of distance, for the slow, silent sabotage of your supply lines. It is a ghost war, fought against shadows and the emptiness they leave behind. Your initial confidence curdles into a gnawing frustration. The sheer scale of the logistical nightmare is unprecedented. Your army, accustomed to living off the land, finds only cinders and starvation. The wagons, groaning under supplies dragged from distant Europe, cannot keep pace with the relentless, fruitless advance. Horses drop from exhaustion and hunger. The cohesion of the Grande Armée, its legendary speed and discipline, begins to fray around the edges, chewed away by the unseen enemy of distance and deprivation. This is the profound, terrible irony unfolding. You are conquering vast stretches of territory, yet gaining nothing of strategic value. No cities to exploit, no population to subjugate, no enemy army brought to heel. You hold land that yields only hardship, stretching your lines of communication and supply to a breaking point, all while the main Russian force remains intact, always just out of reach. They understand that their strength lies not in matching your tactical brilliance on a single day, but in leveraging the immensity of their country, using it as a weapon. Your finely tuned European machine is not built to fight. Your expectation of a quick, decisive blow is thwarted by their cunning avoidance. They refuse to play by your rules of war. This isn't a maneuver on the plains of Italy or the fields of Germany. It's a descent into a void where your carefully laid plans dissolve into dust and ashes. The enemy isn't just Bagration or Barclay. It is the space itself, the scorched earth, the looming shadow of winter yet to come, and the Russian willingness to endure privation you had perhaps underestimated. Consider this strategic pivot point. Your original plan was sound for a different kind of war, but here, persistence in pursuing that plan becomes a fatal flaw. Rigidity in the face of an adapting enemy is a recipe for disaster. Every step forward, every mile conquered, draws you deeper into the trap. Ask yourself, in this moment, pushing deeper into the emptiness, was this unwavering determination or crippling stubbornness? Was it hope for the breakthrough or the inability to admit that the fundamental premise of the campaign had been invalidated? You are chasing a ghost across an infinite plain, and the miles themselves are bleeding your army dry. The ancient walls of Smolensk rise before you, a bastion on the Dnipro. After weeks of chasing shadows across the vast, indifferent plains, this is it, a chance for the decisive engagement you crave. The Russian army, or a significant part of it, stands ready to defend the city. You deploy your forces, the ground trembling under the weight of your ambition, made manifest in cannon and cavalry. The battle rages, a brutal, close-quarters affair around the city's defenses. Your troops, weary but driven by the promise of a major victory, fight with ferocious intensity. You watch the struggle, issuing commands that send columns crashing against the walls, outflanking defenses, pushing relentlessly. The fighting is desperate, the casualties mounting on both sides. As evening descends, a new element enters the fray: fire. The city begins to burn. Flames erupt from buildings, consuming the ancient heart of Smolensk, a terrible, beautiful spectacle against the twilight sky. The Russians, realizing the city is lost and unwilling to be trapped, make their ultimate choice. Under the cover of smoke and chaos, they execute a skilled retreat, slipping away across the river, leaving behind only the inferno and their dead. You enter Smolensk the next morning, smoke still thick in the air, the ground littered with debris and corpses. It is a victory. You have taken a strategically important city. The Russian army did not stand and fight to the last man. But as you survey the ruins, the acrid smell of burnt wood filling your lungs, the truth settles in. This is not the victory you needed. The enemy is not destroyed. They have merely withdrawn, intact and still capable of fighting, deepening their retreat into the limitless expanse of their own country. Smolensk stands as a monument to the deceptive nature of tactical success. You won the battle, you took the ground, but you failed the strategic imperative: to trap and annihilate the main Russian force. What you gained was a burning shell of a city, incapable of supporting your army, bought at the terrible price of thousands of your own soldiers and precious, irreplaceable supplies. Each step deeper into Russia, each battle like Smolensk, whittles away your strength while the enemy merely trades space for time. It's a cruel, agonizing form of warfare you are unaccustomed to, A war of attrition where your greatest asset, speed and decisive battle, is nullified. Here lies a profound, chilling insight into the nature of conquest and leadership. True victory is measured not by markers taken or flags raised, but by whether your actions advance your ultimate goal without crippling your capacity to achieve it. Smolensk is a textbook example of a Pyrrhic victory, a win that costs you more than it cost your foe, weakening you relative to him. The fire that consumed the city seems almost symbolic now. You have consumed your own resources for little lasting gain. Consider this: the Russian strategy, initially scoffed at as cowardice, is proving devastatingly effective. By refusing battle on your terms, by leaving you only scorched earth and empty cities, they turn your strength into a weakness. Your massive army becomes a logistical millstone, requiring unimaginable quantities of food and fodder the land cannot provide. Every day spent chasing them, every victory, like Smolensk, is a step deeper into a trap of your own making, baited with the illusion of progress. Ask yourself, looking at the smoking ruins of Smolensk, was this relentless pursuit, this capture of a burning city, the mark of indomitable will and strategic necessity, or the stubborn refusal to acknowledge a changing, unwinnable game? What would it take to admit that the prize you chase is a phantom, that the ground you gain is poisoned? This city, bought with so much blood and fire, is not a stepping stone to Moscow. It is a warning sign written in ash. You have won a city, but you are losing the campaign, one costly, hollow victory at a time. The sun rises on September 7, 1812, unveiling the vast plains near Borodino. It is a day you have craved, the day to shatter the Russian army in a single decisive blow. Forcing the Tsar to sue for peace, 250,000 men gather, a human tide ready to crash. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, fear, and anticipation. You feel the familiar tension, the strategist's calm before the storm. But this storm will be unlike any you have weathered before. The battle erupts with a ferocity that shakes the ground. Redoubts are taken and retaken. Lines surge and recoil like tormented waves. This is no elegant maneuver or swift encirclement. It is a brutal, grinding slugfest. Every foot of ground is paid for in blood. The roar of cannons is ceaseless, the musketry a constant, deadly hail. Hours pass, each minute stretching into an eternity of carnage. Your army, your magnificent grand army, is being consumed by the insatiable appetite of this terrible field. Corps melt away under the relentless fire. Regiments are reduced to battalions, battalions to companies. The casualty lists climb with horrifying speed. The moment of truth arrives. The Russian lines, though battered and bleeding, still stand. To achieve the annihilation you seek, you must commit your last, most precious resource, your reserves, your old guard. You unleash these veterans, the iron core of your army, into the maelstrom. They advance with unwavering discipline, pushing through the chaos. They break pockets of resistance. They seize key positions. They drive the enemy back. Yet, even this sacrifice is not enough for complete victory. The Russian army, though savaged, does not break completely. They retreat, yes, but they withdraw in order, a wounded beast still capable of fighting. As dusk descends, leaving the field a gruesome tableau of death and suffering, you hold the ground. Borodino is tactically yours, but the cost is staggering. You survey the blood-soaked fields, littered with tens of thousands of your finest soldiers, and the words form in your mind. It is the most terrible battle you ever fought. This, then, is the terrible harvest of Borodino. You sought a decisive victory and gained a tactical one, but at a price that crippled your army's fighting spirit and physical strength. It is the brutal cost of seeking total annihilation against a determined, numerous foe willing to endure horrific losses. Your tactical brilliance secured the field, but it could not replenish the irreplaceable veterans lost this day. Ask yourself, was holding that bloody ground worth the lifeblood of the empire? Borodino reveals a harsh truth. Some victories come at a price so high they feel indistinguishable from defeat. True leadership involves assessing not just the possibility of winning, but the sustainability of the cost. This battle did more than just deplete your ranks. It eroded the core of your veteran army and, perhaps more dangerously, chipped away at the myth of your invincibility. You won the field, yes, but you paid for it with the future of your army, leaving you vulnerable for the trials that lay ahead, alone in the vastness of Russia. You march towards Moscow, the ancient heart of Russia, the prize shimmering on the horizon. Weeks of brutal marching, punishing battles, scorched earth, all for this moment. You envision the scene. A triumphant entry, the boyars bowing, a delegation begging for terms, the Tsar's surrender inevitable once his sacred capital is in your grasp. This is how it works in Europe. You've taken Vienna, Berlin, Madrid. Moscow will be the capstone, the final, undeniable proof of your strategic genius, the moment that forces Alexander to his knees. But as the Grand Army finally enters the city gates, an unnerving silence hangs in the air. Not the hushed awe of a populace awaiting a conqueror, but a profound, unsettling void. You expect crowds, chaos, defiance, or even frightened submission. Instead, you find streets eerily empty. Houses stand silent, windows dark, eyes staring back at your legions. This is not a triumphant procession. It's a march into a tomb. There is no delegation, no sign of authority, no one to surrender the city you have fought so hard to reach. The vast, sprawling metropolis is a ghost town, stripped bare, its inhabitants vanished like smoke. The shock is visceral. You've seized the symbol, the ancient heart, but the lifeblood is gone. The strategic gain you anticipated, the Tsar's capitulation, evaporates with the silence. This empty city exposes a fundamental flaw in your approach. The assumption that capturing territory, even the most important capital, is equivalent to breaking the enemy's will. You hold the stone, the wood, the earth of Moscow, but you hold nothing of Russia's soul, nothing of its resolve. The Russians, you realize with a chilling clarity, chose to abandon their most sacred ground rather than submit. This is defiance expressed not through battle, but through absence. It is a form of resistance you, accustomed to the predictable chess game of European warfare, had not fully comprehended. You stand in the Kremlin, surrounded by empty palaces, a conqueror presiding over a vacuum. This is the hollow victory you never anticipated. Achieving the long-sought objective, Moscow delivers none of the anticipated results. It is a profound leadership failure, born from the belief that your past successes in Europe were universal templates. Your expectation of Moscow's surrender, fueled by triumphs over other empires, blinded you to the unique, brutal reality of Russia's willingness to sacrifice everything. You have reached the destination, the glittering prize you chased across endless plains. But it is an illusion. The city is yours, yes, but you grasp only air, and the vast, silent emptiness feels less like a conquest and more like the trap closing around you. Ask yourself, was this the peak of strategic brilliance or the blinding glare of overconfidence? He marches into Moscow, not the triumphant entry into Vienna or Berlin, but a strange, unsettling quiet. The vast, ancient city, symbol of Russia's heart, lies before him, eerily empty. The golden domes glitter under a September sun, but the streets are deserted. The populace fled, the expected deputation of surrender absent. It feels less like a conquest and more like inheriting a ghost town, a chilling precursor to the storm about to break. You enter the Kremlin, establishing your headquarters, believing you hold the ultimate leverage, the prize for which this arduous march was undertaken. This is the jewel in the crown, the strategic heart you can squeeze to bring the Tsar to terms. For days, the city seems yours, a hollow victory perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. Then the smoke begins, small, isolated plumes at first, dismissed as accidents or minor disturbances, but they grow, merge, become a monstrous, raging inferno. Fires erupt across the city, not randomly, but strategically, simultaneously, fanned by a rising wind. The flames consume everything, buildings, homes, residences included. The vast stockpiles of food and supplies your army desperately needs, the very winter quarters you plan to occupy. You stand on a balcony, the acrid smoke burning your eyes, watching in stunned disbelief as your strategic prize, the city intended as your anchor, turns into a vast, roaring pyre. The city you captured is denying itself to you, destroying its own flesh and bone to leave you nothing but ash and ruin. It is an act of national self-immolation, a radical, desperate maneuver utterly outside the conventional warfare you have mastered. Watching Moscow burn is a visceral lesson in the enemy's boundless determination, a stark illumination of a strategic miscalculation so profound it takes your breath away. This enemy is not playing by the familiar rules of European courts and calculated surrenders. They are operating on a different level of commitment, where preserving national dignity and denying the invader supersedes rational considerations of property or even life. This act of self-destruction, this willingness to sacrifice their most sacred city, was a strategic depth you utterly failed to predict or counter. It shatters the conventional rules of engagement, the established protocols you have relied upon throughout your campaigns. You expected a logical response to conquest based on European norms of power and negotiation. Instead, you faced a national will ready for radical, devastating sacrifice. The flames of Moscow do more than burn the city walls. They burn away the very foundations of your strategic assumptions, illuminating the folly of imposing your own cultural and strategic framework on an opponent who operates from a fundamentally different psychological landscape. The fire burns your hopes along with the city walls, leaving behind only the chilling reality of an unsolvable problem and the scent of defeat on the wind. Ask yourself, what level of commitment are you willing to face in your own challenges? And are you prepared for the enemy who is willing to burn it all down? What would you have done, standing on that balcony, watching your plans turn to smoke? The great city is a shell, a graveyard of ash and stone under a sky that grows colder by the day. You stand amidst the ruins of Moscow, weeks bleeding into each other like unattended wounds. The air bites, carrying the smell of smoke and a chilling premonition of winter. You linger, expecting, needing Alexander I to bend, to acknowledge your position, to sue for peace, as every sensible ruler would after such a conquest. You send envoys, diplomats carrying terms you believe generous, leveraging a victory hard-won in blood and fire. They ride through the desolate landscape towards St. Petersburg, carrying not just messages, but your hopes, your strategic imperative. And you wait. Days turn into a week, then 2, then 3. Silence. The Tsar remains distant, resolute. His only reply the unforgiving vastness of his empire, and a simple, unyielding refusal. He will not negotiate while a single enemy soldier stains his soil. Precious time, more valuable than gold or cannons now, slips through your fingers like sand. The Russian winter, an enemy far more ancient and merciless than any army, gathers its strength on the horizon. Your grand armée, though masters of a burnt city, are guests in a tomb. Supplies dwindle in the charred remains. Logistics, your old friend and enabler, become a nightmare in the desolation. This period of waiting, this paralysis in the heart of a ruined capital, is perhaps your most profound strategic misstep, a chilling study in the dangers of inaction. The crucial insight here is stark. In a situation deteriorating by the hour, waiting for an external solution is not patience, it is self-destruction. You believed your status, the sheer audacity of your presence in Moscow, would force Alexander's hand. You clung to the hope of a political victory that the military reality, the scorched earth, the hostile climate no longer supported. It was a catastrophic failure of judgment, a king waiting for checkmate to declare victory. This is where greatness can curdle into stubbornness. You are waiting for an outcome that will never come, a phantom surrender that exists only in your calculations of power. You are paralyzed, not by an enemy army, but by pride, by an inability to admit that your grand strategy has failed, that the conquest of Russia, in this form, is impossible. Every day spent waiting in Moscow is a day your army weakens, its spirit eroding, its physical strength sapped by hunger and the cold. Every day makes the inevitable retreat, the journey back across the frozen plains, more deadly, more brutal. Your greatest enemy is not outside the city walls, not the Cossacks or the approaching snows, but your own inability to adapt, your own refusal to see the truth inside the ruins you inhabit. What would you have done, standing in his boots, as the silence from St. Petersburg became deafening and the wind howled through the broken windows? The die is cast. Moscow is ashes behind you, the winter sky a cold, indifferent gray above. You issue the order that chills the blood of even the most hardened veteran. Retreat. The Grand Army, this once invincible juggernaut that swept across Europe, turns its back on the east and begins the long, desperate march home. Initially, there's a semblance of order. Formations tighten, officers bark commands, and the weary soldiers fall into step, clinging to the hope of reaching warmer lands, of finding supplies, of simply surviving. But hope is a fragile shield against the reality that is already biting at their heels. The route back is the same one they marched in on, now stripped bare by months of occupation and scorched earth tactics. Every village is empty, every field gleaned. What little sustenance exists must be fought over, hoarded. And then the weather turns. The first snow falls, not in gentle flakes, but in a relentless, biting fury. Temperatures plummet. The carefully planned, or perhaps optimistically assumed, logistical chain snaps like an icicle. Wagons become stuck in the mud, then frozen in the ice. Horses, already weakened by lack of fodder, collapse in their traces. Cannon, the symbols of your power, must be abandoned, their weight too great for the starving teams. The true test of any system isn't how it expands, but how it contracts under pressure. Your grand army, built for rapid advance and decisive victory, proves terrifyingly ill-equipped for a grinding, agonizing retreat. Disease, always lurking, explodes through the ranks. Typhus, dysentery, frostbite that claims limbs and lives with silent efficiency. Men stumble, fall, and are left behind, their comrades too weak or too self-absorbed in their own survival to help. Adding to the horror are the Cossack raiders. Like wolves scenting weakness, they emerge from the desolate landscape, swift and merciless. They don't stand and fight pitched battles. They harass the flanks, slash at the rear, picking off stragglers, cutting down the sick, burning abandoned wagons, and vanishing back into the snow. They are death by 1,000 cuts. A constant reminder that even in retreat, the enemy is still present, still active. What began as a strategic withdrawal rapidly devolves into a fight for individual survival. The army, this proud embodiment of French military might, transforms before your eyes into a desperate, shuffling mob, driven forward by fear and the primal instinct to escape the cold, the hunger, the constant threat. The carefully planned logistics, the pride of your campaigns, collapse under the weight of starvation and frostbite. This road back, you realize with chilling certainty, is not paved with glory, but with the frozen corpses of the soldiers who trusted you to lead them, feed them, protect them. You asked for an empire in the East, and the East is now delivering only suffering, measured in dead men. Ask yourself, when the grand plan fails, when the invincible machine breaks down, does the leader's responsibility end at the command to retreat, or does it extend to every single soldier left behind? What does it mean to lead men, not to victory, but through the jaws of disaster? The infamous Russian winter arrives in full force. It doesn't creep in. It slams down like a physical blow, a white fist closing around the retreating columns. Temperatures plummet, turning the vast open landscape into a frozen hellscape. This is not the crisp, manageable cold of a Paris winter. This is a deep, bone-aching, soul-freezing chill that penetrates everything. You watch, your own breath fogging in the biting air, as the carefully constructed order of the Grand Army unravels. Men freeze to death on the march, often simply sitting down for a moment's rest, never to rise again. Their bodies become grotesque landmarks in the endless white. Horses, the vital engines of your logistics and cavalry, collapse by the thousands, their strength giving out against the snow and ice. Their carcasses are quickly stripped for meat by starving soldiers, a horrifying descent into desperation. Equipment, crucial for survival and defense, breaks in the extreme cold. Wagons splinter, cannon wheels crack, muskets become brittle. Food is not scarce. It is non-existent. The scorched earth tactics of the Russians, combined with the speed of the retreat and the breakdown of transport, mean there are no supplies. Soldiers are forced to eat anything they can find. Dead horses, dogs, tree bark, even resorting to cannibalism in the most extreme cases. though official histories seldom dwell on such grim details. Discipline, the very foundation of your military machine, evaporates like mist in the wind. Survival becomes the sole, brutal focus. The man next to you is no longer a comrade, but a potential competitor for a scrap of frozen horseflesh. The Grand Army, the symbol of your power, the instrument of your will that swept across Europe, dissolves into scattered bands of starving, freezing, desperate men, indistinguishable from ragged beggars. This stage of the retreat isn't just a military defeat. It is nature's merciless judgment on ambition, unchecked by reality. The chilling insight delivered by this frozen nightmare is that the most brilliant human plans, the most complex strategies, are terrifyingly fragile when confronted by forces utterly outside human control. You underestimated the Russian winter just as profoundly as you underestimated the Russian resolve. You marched into Moscow confident you could dictate terms. You march out broken by forces you couldn't even fight. The moral reflection here is stark and unforgiving. Arrogance in the face of nature is perhaps the ultimate folly. You believed you could conquer the land itself, bending its seasons and geography to your will. But the land, aided by its unforgiving climate, is conquering your army man by man, horse by horse, cannon by cannon. The suffering you witness daily, the endless files of walking skeletons wrapped in rags, is a direct consequence of your decisions, a terrifying visual of the human cost of strategic blunders fueled by ego and a refusal to see the world as it is, rather than as you wished it to be. The vast, silent plains, once the canvas for your grand ambitions of reshaping Europe, are now a sprawling, unmarked cemetery for your soldiers, a frozen monument to hubris. Look into the eyes of these men, the few who still have eyes open, and ask yourself, is this glory, or is this the bill finally arriving? You reach the banks of the Berezina, and the biting wind feels like a physical blow. Spread before you is not a frozen highway as hoped, but a cruel, wide river, partially thawed, its waters gray and unforgiving. Behind you, the relentless pursuit of Russian armies. Before you, an almost insurmountable obstacle. And your army, already skeletal and broken by the retreat, faces annihilation. This is the abyss born of strategic failure. Your grand gamble on Moscow has led to this bottleneck, this icy choke point. The essential pontoons were lost earlier in the disastrous march, another consequence of decisions made miles and months ago. Now, survival hinges on the impossible, building bridges across this treacherous waterway under the enemy's guns, in conditions that would kill a lesser force even without a fight. It is the ultimate tactical test, forced by overwhelming strategic error. The scene that unfolds is one of horrific, soul-shattering chaos. As engineers, men whose names should be etched in history, plunge into the freezing water to hammer pilings. The shattered remnants of the Grande Armée surge towards the makeshift crossings. It is a crush of humanity. Soldiers, walking wounded, civilians who followed the army, carts laden with what little was salvaged from the ruin. Panic is a tangible force, thick in the air like the freezing mist rising from the river. Cannons roar from the Russian side, tearing gaps in the desperate throng. The bridges groan, threaten to splinter under the weight. You watch this nightmare unfold, a testament to the price paid for ambition unchecked. Men and women are crushed in the stampede. Others slip on the icy banks or are pushed into the frigid water, their screams swallowed by the wind and the din of battle. The Berezina becomes a liquid graveyard, littered with the hopes and lives of those who could not reach the fragile safety of the opposite bank. It is a fight not just against the enemy, but against nature itself, against fatigue, against despair. Yet, amidst this overwhelming disaster, a defiant, brutal heroism emerges. The engineers, led by the stoic General Eble, work without rest, often freezing to death at their posts, their hands bloody from the relentless labor. They embody a deeper insight, the human capacity for courage and resourcefulness in the face of certain doom, a stark, ironic counterpoint to the strategic leadership that placed them in this predicament. These men, driven by duty and a desperate will to live, perform miracles, holding the fragile lifelines open for as long as humanly possible. Their sacrifice, their impossible labor, is the only reason any significant portion of the army escapes. It is a horrifying, desperate extraction, paid for in blood and ice. Ask yourself, what does leadership mean when your strategic vision has collapsed into such granular, horrific chaos? Is it the architect of the disaster who is tested, or the men on the ground finding impossible ways to survive? The Berezina is a narrow escape, yes, a moment where a fraction of the army clawed its way back from extinction. But it also underscores, with brutal clarity, the true scale of the disaster you, Napoleon, engineered. The survival of these men here is a tribute to the fighting spirit you instilled, the ultimate tragic irony that they use this spirit to survive the consequences of your own mistakes. The snow bites at your face, a relentless enemy mirroring the one you flee. You look back, not truly seeing the tattered, starving remnants of the Grand Army struggling across the frozen plains, but feeling their weight like chains on your soul. This vast, glorious instrument of your will, forged in countless victories, is shattered, dissolving into the white void. Your decision is made, cold and sharp as the December air. You will leave them. Under the cloak of strategic necessity, the urgent need to raise new armies, to defend the empire against a resurgent Europe, sharpening its blades in your absence, you entrust the wreckage to Murat. He is brave, loyal, but lacks your strategic mind, your iron will. He is left to oversee the agonizing death of an army while you make haste. By sleigh, by carriage, across the frozen continent you race, the miles ticking away the distance between you and the disaster, but also between you and the men who followed you into the inferno. This journey back to Paris, seemingly practical, politically astute, is a dagger in the heart of the Napoleonic myth. The emperor who marched among his grenadiers, who shared their privations, or the carefully curated image of sharing them, is now seen abandoning them to a gruesome fate. The optics are ruinous. While Paris needs your presence, needs the symbol of authority to prevent collapse, the soldiers, freezing and dying by the thousand, need their leader. Here is the brutal calculus of absolute power, laid bare in the snow. The survival of the army, the beating heart of your martial glory, is weighed against the survival of the state, the throne, the empire itself. You choose the state, believing you can rebuild the army once the foundation is secure. It is a decision born of cold logic, of political instinct honed by years at the pinnacle. Yet, it is also perceived as the ultimate betrayal. Ask yourself, when does strategic necessity cross the line into moral abandonment? The return to Paris, while arguably saving your throne for a time, paid a devastating price in the coin of loyalty and reputation. The bond with the grognards, the grizzled veterans who adored you, is irrevocably damaged. The myth of the emperor who was his army begins to crumble, chipped away by the perception of him seeking safety while they perished. It is a harsh, lonely lesson in the weight of command. Decisions that preserve the structure may shatter the spirit, leaving you secure in your palace but isolated from the very people whose faith made you invincible. You race home, saving the crown, but perhaps losing the unwavering devotion that was your greatest weapon. The ice-scarred winds of winter carried the truth, not in official communiques carefully spun, but in the ragged, skeletal specters that stumbled back across the frozen plains of Poland and Prussia. News of the Russian disaster filters back to Europe, a chilling whisper that swells into an undeniable roar. The scale of the destruction is staggering. Not just a defeat, but an apocalypse. Hundreds of thousands dead, swallowed by the snow and the unforgiving distances. The Grand Army annihilated not just as a fighting force, but as a living entity. The eagles that once soared over Austerlitz and Jena now lay broken in drifts. For years, you had been the storm, the force of nature no lesser nation could stand against. Kings bowed, emperors made reluctant alliances, maps were redrawn with a stroke of your pen. Your name alone was a weapon, instilling awe and fear in equal measure. But now, suddenly, you are no longer invincible. The armor of myth, painstakingly forged on countless battlefields and burnished by propaganda, has cracked, exposing something human underneath: vulnerability. It is a scent the wolves of Europe recognize instantly. The kings and nations you subjugated or allied with out of fear, who chafed under your continental system and resented your dominance, see an opportunity. The air, once thick with submission, crackles with ambition and long-suppressed rage. They had cowered, perhaps, but they had not forgotten. Like tectonic plates under immense pressure, they begin to shift. The Sixth Coalition begins to form, sensing your weakness. Drawn together by the shared knowledge that the seemingly unassailable fortress has a breach, Austria, your reluctant ally bound by marriage, hesitates, calculates. Prussia, crushed and humiliated years ago, stirs with a fierce desire for vengeance. Russia, of course, is already at your throat, tasting victory on the frozen steppes. And Great Britain, the perennial enemy, watches from its island stronghold, its navy strangling your trade, its gold financing your enemies. A patient spider weaving its web while you bled yourself white inland. Meanwhile, Spain continues to bleed you dry, a festering wound you cannot close. The guerrilla war, a hydra that grew 2 heads for every one you severed, ties down hundreds of thousands of your best troops, draining resources and morale in a relentless, brutal grind. It is a war without grand battles you can win decisively, just a constant, debilitating hemorrhage. This widespread reaction across the continent demonstrates with brutal clarity how quickly perceived weakness can unravel years of established power. Your authority, built primarily on the projection of invincibility, proves inherently fragile. The moment the myth is shattered, the underlying resentments and ambitions of others are unleashed with terrifying speed. Your carefully constructed system of alliances and dependencies, held together by fear and the promise of your protection through strength, proves hollow the moment you stumble. They were fair-weather friends and forced allies, and the storm has arrived. Ask yourself, was this the inevitable consequence of unchecked hubris, pushing beyond the limits of human endurance and logistics into the vast, empty heart of Russia? Or was it simply the cost of challenging the established order so fundamentally, of creating an empire whose very existence depended on perpetual victory? The insight is stark and unforgiving. Authority built solely on the projection of invincibility is a house of cards. Once the myth is punctured, the true, often hostile intentions of others are revealed. Your carefully constructed system of alliances and dependencies proves hollow the moment you stumble, dissolving like morning mist under the rising sun of renewed hostility. The takeaway is clear. True leadership builds resilience through more than just force. It requires trust, shared interest, a sense of mutual gain, and a foundation that can withstand setbacks, not just prevent them. Your empire was a pyramid balanced on its tip, your singular genius and the unmatched strength of your army. When that tip was blunted, shattered, and buried in the snows of Russia, the entire structure began to topple, not with a bang, but with a cascade of defections, uprisings, and declarations of war. The world learns that even Napoleon can bleed, and that knowledge, that crack in the facade of the invincible, empowers your enemies more than any single victory could have done. The hunt is on. You stand not in the snows of 1812, but in the quiet present, looking back across the chasm of history at the wreckage left by that single fateful decision. You had marched east, not towards victory in battle alone, but towards the utter subjugation of a stubborn Tsar, the final sealing of your continental system, the ultimate imposition of your will upon the map of Europe. What began with the thunderous crossing of the Niemen River by the Grande Armée, an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry, morphed into a slow, agonizing retreat from a phantom enemy and a brutal, unforgiving climate. The ambition was boundless. The cost became immeasurable. Over 500,000 lives lost from your side alone. Frenchmen, Italians, Poles, Germans, soldiers drawn from every corner of your sprawling empire. The flower of a generation perished in the pursuit of absolute control. The invasion of Russia, born from the belief that your will could overcome any obstacle, distance, climate, the sheer size of the enemy's territory, the enemy's refusal to stand and fight your preferred battle, stands as a monumental testament to the principle of overreach. Your generals pleaded caution. Your marshals expressed concern. The signs were there: stretched supply lines, a scorched earth strategy implemented by the retreating Russians, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the operation. But you saw only the prize, Moscow, the symbolic heart, believing its capture would force a capitulation. A surprising detail, perhaps overlooked in the drama of the retreat, is that Moscow itself offered little strategic value in the traditional sense. It was a political target, an act of defiance against the endless space of Russia, a desperate attempt to find solid ground in a shifting, retreating landscape. You occupied the city only to find it ablaze, a Pyrrhic victory followed by a devastating realization. Your primary enemy was not the Tsar's army, but time and distance. What began as ambition, the drive to achieve, to conquer, to build something vast and lasting, to reshape continents in your image, curdled into hubris. The unprecedented success you cultivated through years of brilliant campaigning and administrative reform became the very fertilizer for your greatest failure. You believed your destiny was not merely to lead men, but to command the elements, the distances, and the unyielding spirit of a nation that would rather burn its own capital than submit. you found yourself shattered against them. The retreat was not just a military defeat. It was a stripping away of the illusion of invincibility, a march through a frozen hell that decimated the army that had been the instrument of your will for so long. Tragic irony. The army built on speed and surprise was undone by slowness and predictability, trapped by the very vastness you sought to conquer. The lesson echoes across centuries, a chilling reminder from the Berezina crossing and the endless frozen roads. The same qualities that enable extraordinary achievement, boldness, vision, self-belief, the refusal to accept limits, can, in excess, become fatal flaws, leading even the most brilliant minds to ignore reality and march headlong into disaster. Ask yourself, standing at the peak of your power in 1811, with Europe largely subdued, what would you have done? What if you had stopped at the Niemen? What if, seeing the landscape and the enemy's strategy after the initial advances, you had consolidated power, fortified your borders, negotiated from a position of strength, accepted a less than absolute victory over Russia rather than pushing into the void? History, of course, offers no replays, but the question lingers, a chilling reminder that the path not taken might have led to preservation rather than destruction. Your life, a dazzling tapestry of genius and conquest, is marked indelibly by this dark thread of ruin, a self-inflicted wound born of boundless, unchecked ambition that finally, inevitably, encountered a force it could not break. The winds of history carry a timeless warning from your fate, specifically the fate sealed on the road from Moscow. The greatest empires often fall not to overwhelming external enemies, but to the internal corrosion of overconfidence and the refusal to know when enough is enough. You had reached the summit, and in attempting to climb higher still into the very stratosphere of power, you plummeted back to earth. The snows melt, the battlefields fade, and the roar of cannons dies down, leaving only the quiet echo of the decisions made. The invasion of Russia wasn't just a military campaign. It was a collision between an unstoppable force and an immovable object, where the immovable object was simply the reality of geography, climate, and a nation's stubborn refusal to yield. Napoleon, the master strategist, the iron-willed leader, was ultimately defeated not by a clever flanking maneuver or a superior army in a set-piece battle, but by the vast, indifferent landscape and his own inability to conceive of limits to his power. This moment, the disastrous retreat from Moscow, marks the undeniable turning point. Everything that followed, the desperate scramble to raise new armies, the final defeats, the exiles, was a direct consequence of that hubristic march east. The lesson is stark, and perhaps the most profound wisdom history offers from his story. There is a fine, almost imperceptible line between immense ambition and ruinous overreach. Napoleon crossed it on the road to Moscow. He believed he could bend the world entirely to his will, that his intellect and determination were enough to overcome any physical or human obstacle. He was wrong. His legacy, therefore, is a monument to the extraordinary, the legal code, the administrative reforms, the sheer improbable rise from Corsican outsider to Emperor of Europe. But it is forever shadowed by the profound human cost of believing one is invincible. The final reflection isn't about the glory of his victories, but the tragedy of his fall. A fall engineered less by his enemies than by the excess of his own defining trait. In the ruins of his aspirations, contemplating the loss of an empire and the staggering human cost, perhaps the quote attributed to him rings with a tragic, unintended irony. The transition from the head of a whole nation to a mere individual is a change of rapture. But the rapture wasn't in the transition itself, which was devastating. It was in the dizzying height before the fall, a height achieved by ambition and ultimately undone by its unchecked excess. The story of Napoleon's Russia campaign is a chilling reminder that even the Sun King can be extinguished by the vast, cold night if he flies too high. In the end, it wasn't the battlefield that defeated him. It was believing he couldn't lose.